whenever you are ready, and time starts after your acknowledgements.
Hello everyone, thank you for coming to listen today. I'd like to start by thanking Professor Eric Brown and the INDS faculty, my faculty mentors Maggie Holland and Rita Turner, Dr. Lansing in the GES department who funded the transcription of my interviews, my family and community, and especially the farmers who participated in my interviews. All of you have been part of the process of humbling and inspiring me throughout this capstone project. The title of my project is Changes in Somerset County Conventional Agriculture, a Multi-Generational Farmer at a Crossroads. I'd like to begin with a poem by Gilbert Byron. His speech is slow and thrifty, like the man, and overlaid with echoes of the past. His are the ancient ways born of the land, and fostered by the north wind's forceful blast. He wears his manners with a courtly grace that turns his patches into princely cloak. This is the heritage of steadfast race, of men as rooted as the massive oak, of men who love beyond the need for speech, the fruitful promise of their fertile fields, who venerate the river and the beach, and reap from autumn more than harvest yields. Such love is homage to his place of birth, as sure as spring, as ageless as the earth. I think this poem represents sort of this idealistic farmer, or the image of a farmer that we have in our minds. The purpose of this capstone is to understand the stereotypes surrounding poultry and grain farmers and sort of deconstruct them. We see farmers as not open to change, and we see them as always hating regulation. This work builds on previous work in especially anthropology on farmer morality and identity and the alienation of farmers because of regulations that they don't feel like line up with their morality or identity. The current issues that the community is facing in Somerset County, Wicomico, and Worcester counties is that the proximity and pollution from poultry houses is coming closer and closer to home. So poultry houses there are more of them, they're bigger houses, and they're closer to residential areas. So residents, neighbors of farmers are concerned about property values, air pollution, and Chesapeake Bay pollution. There's a new population of immigrant farmers in the community, and there's a language barrier there. Many of them are from Asia. And they have a different culture than multi-generational farmers. There are also corporate farms, and there are new planning and zoning laws in response to these issues. The laws were mainly focused on creating kind of a setback or a distance that farms would have to be from residential dwellings. So in short, residents and multi-generational farmers are united in their fear of change and the expansion of the poultry industry. This is a picture of poultry houses on the Eastern Shore. It comes from Bay Journal, and they're talking about these houses in particular because they are larger, they look much more industrial because they are bigger and more imposing. You can have anywhere from 8 to 12 of these things on a farm now. So it's really gone up in scale. The research question I chose is, how have socioeconomic, ecological, cultural, and political systems influenced multi-generational farmers' values, opinions, and knowledge in relation to agro-environmental regulations in Somerset County, Maryland? And what could this mean for the future of multi-generational farming? So this question is really grounded in the data and the 4 dynamic systems that I discovered that influence way of life for farmers. The methods I chose were first ethnography as a way to contextualize my experience as a researcher in relation to the culture. I used semi-structured interviews with 9 conventional farmers. 6 were in grain, 1 was in poultry, and 2 of them were grain and poultry farmers. All of them were multi-generational. To analyze this data, I used qualitative analysis and interview coding. You can see in the table that I used that I coded for opinions on environmentalists and poultry integrators. Poultry integrators are corporations, poultry corporations, and their opinions on politics and science. Overall, the values I coded for came down to stewardship and farmers' feelings about stewardship. The knowledge I coded for had a lot to do with best management practices and stewardship that was actually outside of the legislation. This is a map of the disciplinary perspectives that I used within this research. Each of the fields are connected to one another multi-directionally, and it's a complex network for this map. Cultural anthropology defines local knowledge for us. Environmental systems and public health inform us of the effect of farming on the environment and health. Environmental policy is based on our values, but it's informed by the science. And geography tells us that place shapes outcomes that all of these other disciplines describe. So for the scholarship of interdisciplinarity, I have problem solved through instrumental interdisciplinarity. I have borrowed a compound concept from Julianna, who is an anthropologist that drew on many disciplines that I didn't even focus on in this research. But I borrowed it from him because he did focus on cultural change in relation to the environment. And I created complex multicausal explanations within my analysis of the 4 systems. So these are the 4 systems we're talking about. Finally get to the good stuff. The poultry-centered economy is the socioeconomic system that's been built on the interdependence of poultry and grain farmers based on poultry manure as a commodity. So farmers have a social relationship, they have kind of a culture that they created there, but they also have an economic dependence on one another. The fact that that grain farmers rely on cheap poultry manure, and the fact that poultry farmers require a way to get rid of their poultry manure creates this relationship. This, in turn, has influenced the health of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. We know that anthropogenic or human influence has created a need for more conscious methods of farming. And then we move into Maryland's regulatory system, which was in response to the pollution of the Chesapeake Bay. However, farmers feel that they are used as a scapegoat within that system for environmentalists and poultry integrators. Finally, we move to the common sense cultural system that upholds the reputation of farmers and poultry integrators, actually, because farmers are creating stewardship practices, applying best management practices that are outside of the legislation as a way to protect the value of their land and protect their community. Okay. So in conclusion, these 4 systems affected farmers in 3 major ways. There's been a deconstruction of the poultry-centered economy because of regulations. So the fact that they can't spread as much poultry manure on the fields and the fact that poultry manure has to be shipped off the shore now has certainly influenced the connection. Stewardship and more conscious methods of farming have been a product of these 4 systems, but finally the alienation of farmers remains. And those who wanted to stay in conventional farming have changed their opinions on environmentalism and regulations, and that's the most optimistic piece of this research. There's new knowledge that has become traditional, knowledge about stewardship and technology that should be applied for better stewardship. And even though there's conflict with new stakeholders involving issues of pollution, these are new groups, so it creates a new relationship for us to work through. Because we're dealing now with neighbors that are upset about pollution and immigrants that are new to the community and new to the culture. For the limitations of this research, it's really only skimming the surface. The data is relatively insignificant because of the sample size, only 9 interviews, and the timeline. More longitudinal research would be highly valuable in this field. It's representative of a moment in time. Cultures experience evolution and change. Your opinions change from day to day. However, this capstone is a pilot project, and I think it's a really exciting one. For future research, at least some farmers are open to change. There's an opportunity for collaboration, more research on intercultural communication, and agricultural alternatives and a diversified economy would greatly benefit the Eastern Shore. This work is important and valuable because it asks the question, how do communities see themselves and the issues they face? This is something that we've been diving into now for a long time in a variety of fields, but we're still looking for more of a bottom-up approach rather than a great deal of policy research has been, which is more top-down. And when understanding dynamic systems and the change that results from them, we can understand how to act and when to act. So that concludes my research. Thank you.
So you said this is a pilot study, and that's great work. I was wondering, if this were extended into the future, how large a sample size do you think you would need?
At this point, I am not really sure about what the sample size would look like. I think I would continue to talk to these 9 farmers, and I would look for more poultry farmers specifically. Because I did only have access to one farmer that was just in poultry. I would really like to have access to the immigrant community to understand where they're coming from and how they see poultry as sacred, because their definition of sacred is different.
Thank you.
Were there any characteristics that stood out to you in terms of the farmers that were more open to change?
So the farmers that were more open to change tended to be of higher socioeconomic status. They tended to have more education. They tended to be more involved in the policy locally, statewide, and nationally. Farmers that were less open to change were often aging out of farming. They maybe didn't have children that were in farming anymore.
Could you say more about Dana Meadows' work and how it influenced your analysis, her thinking in systems? Did you look at negative feedback loops? I mean, how deep did you go into systems analysis?
So systems analysis for me was definitely a way to begin to conceptualize this work, but because there is so much complexity within each system, it was difficult to nail down all of the feedback loops, because there are still things about the poultry-centered economy, for example, that I don't fully understand. There are things about, the reason that there's a new population of immigrants that I don't fully understand yet. Mm-hmm. Yes.
So I guess almost following on that, can you help us understand this in the context of other work that is addressing similar issues?
Sure.
What's out there, and what is new about what you've done?
People that I've been in contact in particular with are the Center for a Livable Future at Hopkins University. We've been talking about ways that alternative forms of agriculture could be really important for the Eastern Shore, especially for their economy. As of now, it seems that every conversation at a town hall meeting gets to a point where the alternatives aren't really there, and so people are saying, you want us to stop farming conventionally, but what are we going to do instead? So that's the next step, I think, at this point. We're asking those questions. What are the alternatives, really?
And if I'm hearing you right, you're saying nobody's actually talked to the farmers in the way that you have?
No, not recently. So in 2000, as I talked about, the anthropologist Paoliso and Maloney out of College Park did talk to them. But they were focusing on regulation and alienation. They weren't focusing on openness to change, or really environmentalism and how that lines up with stewardship practices.
I'm going to ask you to speculate. What's going to happen? I mean, what's the trajectory, right? What do you see happening with poultry farmers and grain farmers in the next, 5 or 10 years?
I see two potential paths, and this is generalizing. That poultry farmers, multi-generational farmers, will age out of the system and they won't exist there anymore. And immigrant farmers will sort of replace them, and that the grain farmers that remain, multi-generational farmers, will be at much larger scale. So they'll have more acreage, they'll have more investment into their operations. Farmers have multi-million-dollar businesses now when they're grain farmers, so it's a very different world.
And just to follow on that, so when you were talking about willingness to change and more on the sort of demographic, socioeconomic profile, what about the poultry versus the grain farmers? Are some of these larger scale grain farmers interested, or?
Larger scale grain farmers are more open to change, and they do adapt and change based on the regulations, based on market, because they have more flexibility than poultry farmers. Poultry farmers are, not to get in it too much, but they are on a competitive contract. They have to compete with one another and further invest into their operations in order to stay profitable, because their company gives them a bonus based on how much they invest. So, yeah. They are in a much tighter situation, and actually the main question right now for places like Hopkins is, what are poultry farms, what could they be turned into? Because you see this huge structure, and